James Caldwell had never been a man of faith, nor had he ever believed in fate, but as he stood in front of his wife's grave at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, a cold wind cut through his expensive coat, making him feel an unfamiliar chill. He had been coming here every year since Eleanor's sudden death 3 years ago. It had become a ritual, a moment of solitude in an otherwise meticulously controlled life. The marble headstone gleamed under the weak afternoon sun, the engraving still crisp. Eleanor Caldwell, loving wife and devoted soul, 1979 to 2021. He placed a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, at the base of the grave, his mind lost in memories of her laughter, the way she used to touch his arm when she spoke, the warmth she carried in her presence. Life had lost its color since she had left, and though he had tried to fill the void with work, investments and social engagements, nothing had ever truly replaced her absence. As he stood there lost in thought, something shifted in the air. A strange feeling as if he were being watched crept over him. Turning slightly, he noticed a boy, no older than 10, standing a few feet away. He was too thin for his age, his clothes slightly tattered, his sneakers worn to the sole. His dark eyes were fixed on James with an intensity that unsettled him. James wasn't the type to interact with strangers, let alone children, but something about the boy's presence felt unnatural, almost eerie. He was alone, with no sign of parents or guardians nearby. The cemetery was quiet, with only a few distant visitors tending to their own losses. James cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unease. "Hey kid, are you lost?" he asked, his voice gruffer than intended. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving James's face. "She didn't die the way you think she did." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, that his mind was playing tricks on him, distorting the boy's words into something sinister. But the child's face was serious, his tone unwavering, as if he were merely stating a fact. James felt a rush of cold blood through his veins. His rational mind screamed that this was nonsense. Eleanor had died of an undiagnosed heart condition, a cruel and sudden twist of fate. The doctors had been clear, the autopsy had confirmed it. There had been no foul play, no mystery, just a tragic, unexplained loss. And yet, here stood this boy, a complete stranger, speaking as if he knew something James didn't. James forced himself to stay calm. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice controlled but firm. The boy hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, then took another step closer. "She was poisoned," he whispered, the words barely audible, but they might as well have been shouted for the impact they had on James. His breath hitched, and for a moment he felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Poisoned? The absurdity of the claim warred with the unease crawling up his spine. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh in the boy's face and walk away, but something in the child's expression stopped him. There was no humor, no playfulness, just a quiet certainty. James knelt slightly to the boy's level, lowering his voice. "Who told you that?" he demanded. "Who are you?" The boy looked around as if afraid someone was listening, then took another step back. "I can't talk here," he said, his voice now trembling slightly. "They might be watching." James's heart pounded. This was madness. And yet he couldn't walk away. The boy turned sharply as if sensing danger, then without another word ran off, disappearing between the towering headstones before James could react. He stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the boy had been, his mind racing. His instincts told him to let it go, to chalk it up to a disturbed child's imagination. But another part of him, the part that had never fully accepted Eleanor's death, the part that still woke up at night feeling something was wrong, refused to dismiss it. He needed to know more. His mind whirled with questions. Who was that boy? How did he know Eleanor? And most importantly, if there was even a shred of truth in what he had said, who had poisoned his wife? That night, back in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, James found himself going through Eleanor's old medical records. He hadn't looked at them in years, not since the doctors had confirmed that her heart had simply failed. But as he stared at the paperwork, something gnawed at him. He read over the reports, the toxicology results, the official statements, but he found nothing unusual. Yet his gut told him there was more. If the boy was right, if Eleanor had been poisoned, then someone had covered it up. But why? And who would have wanted to harm her? Eleanor had no enemies, she had been the kindest person James had ever known. He barely slept that night. The boy's voice echoed in his head, "She didn't die the way you think she did." By morning, James knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to find that child. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James Caldwell spent the entire next day consumed by the boy's words. He tried to focus on work, on the endless meetings and financial reports that usually occupied his mind, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that brief, unsettling conversation at the cemetery. He had built his entire empire on logic and precision, on numbers and calculated risks, yet now, for the first time in years, he was willing to chase a whisper of doubt. That night, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, he drove back to Greenwood Cemetery, hoping to find the child again. The evening air was crisp, the last traces of daylight slipping away as the streetlights flickered to life. The cemetery was nearly empty, just an old man tending to a grave and a woman leaving with fresh flowers in hand. James scanned the area, looking between the headstones and down the winding paths, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. He walked the length of the cemetery, checking near Eleanor's grave again, but all he found was the withering bouquet of lilies he had left the day before. Frustration crept into his chest. Had he imagined it? Had grief finally twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't there? He had never believed in ghosts or omens, but something about the boy had felt real, too real to dismiss as a figment of his imagination. Just as he was about to leave, he spotted a cemetery worker locking up a small shed near the entrance. James approached him, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The man, a middle-aged worker with tired eyes and a thick Brooklyn accent, looked up in mild surprise. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. James hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no harm in asking. "Yesterday I was here and I saw a young boy, maybe 10 years old. Thin, dark-haired, worn-out clothes. Do you know if he comes around often?" The worker frowned, rubbing his chin. "A kid? Nah, we don't usually see kids alone around here. Place closes before dark and most parents don't bring their little ones. Are you sure it wasn't someone visiting with family?" James shook his head. He was alone. And he seemed scared. The worker's frown deepened. "That doesn't sound right. There's no reason for a kid to be hanging around here alone. What did he say to you?" James hesitated. He wasn't ready to share the details, not yet. "Nothing much," he lied. "Just something strange." The worker exhaled, shaking his head. "Well, if you see him again, maybe let the groundskeeper know. Last thing we need is a lost kid wandering around." James nodded, though he knew that wasn't the case. That boy hadn't been lost, he had been there for a reason. James left the cemetery more determined than before. He needed to find out who that boy was and, more importantly, what he knew about Eleanor's death. He spent the next few days making discreet inquiries. He reached out to an old contact, Ethan Hayes, a private investigator who had worked with him in the past on corporate matters. Ethan was sharp, discreet, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. When James explained the situation, Ethan's reaction was skeptical but professional. "You're telling me a random kid showed up at your wife's grave and told you she was murdered?" he asked, leaning back in his chair at the small, cluttered office he operated out of in downtown Manhattan. James, sitting across from him, nodded. "I know how it sounds, but I need to find that boy. If he knows something, I need to hear it." Ethan studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right. I'll check around, see if anyone matches the description." Days passed with no results. James kept his routine, but every moment he wasn't working, his mind was on Eleanor. He revisited old memories, moments that had seemed normal at the time but now felt tainted with doubt. She had been healthy, full of life. Then suddenly she had fallen ill. Doctors had struggled to find the cause, and within weeks she was gone. The grief had been overwhelming, but he had trusted what the medical reports said. Now he wasn't so sure. Then late one evening Ethan called. "I might have something," he said. James sat up in his chair, gripping the phone tighter. "Go on." Ethan hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I checked some local reports, asked a few people around the area. There's a kid that fits your description. Name's Adam. He's been in and out of shelters, no permanent home. But here's the part you need to hear. Your wife, she used to visit one of the shelters where he stayed. More than once." James felt his breath catch. Eleanor knew him? Ethan exhaled. "Looks like it. The staff at a small shelter in Queens confirmed she used to come by, bringing donations, talking to some of the kids. Nobody thought much of it, just charity work. But if this kid is coming to you now, there's a reason." James's mind raced. Eleanor had never mentioned visiting a shelter. Why would she keep that from him? And more importantly, what had she known about Adam that had made him seek James out? Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James sat in his office, staring at the dimly lit skyline of Manhattan, his mind restless with unanswered questions. The revelation that Eleanor had visited a shelter, one where this mysterious boy had stayed, changed everything. It wasn't the charitable act itself that unsettled him. Eleanor had always been kind, always looking for ways to help others. But why hadn't she mentioned it? Why keep something so seemingly innocent a secret? The thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He picked up his phone and called Ethan. "Can you get me the address of that shelter?" he asked without preamble. Ethan sighed on the other end. "I figured you'd want to go. It's a small place in Queens, off Roosevelt Avenue. But listen, James, be careful. If this kid knows something dangerous, there's a reason he's hiding." James didn't reply. He already knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he spoke to Adam himself. The next morning he drove to Queens, weaving through traffic, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he neared the shelter. It was an old brick building tucked between a laundromat and a small grocery store, its exterior worn but clean. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and stale air filled his lungs as he walked toward the reception desk. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and graying hair looked up at him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "I'm looking for Adam," James said, keeping his tone neutral. "I was told he used to stay here." The woman frowned slightly, eyeing him with suspicion. "Who are you?" He hesitated. Telling her he was a rich businessman wouldn't help. "My wife, Eleanor Caldwell, used to visit here." I believe she knew him. At the mention of Eleanor's name, the woman's expression changed. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by something else, something close to sadness. "Eleanor? Yes, she was wonderful. She cared about the kids here more than most." Her voice softened. "But Adam, he doesn't stay here anymore. He left a few months ago." James felt a pang of frustration. "Do you know where he is?" The woman hesitated, glancing around as if debating whether to tell him. Finally she sighed. "He comes around sometimes looking for food or a place to sleep when he's got nowhere else. But he's scared, always looking over his shoulder. I don't know what he's caught up in, but I know it's bad." James leaned in slightly. "Please. If you see him again, tell him I need to talk to him. It's important." The woman studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "If I see him, I'll let him know." James left the shelter feeling no closer to the truth than before. He had expected answers, but instead he was left with more questions. What was Adam running from? And what had Eleanor gotten herself involved in? As he drove back to Manhattan, he tried to remember if there had ever been signs, any hints that Eleanor had been hiding something from him. Their life together had seemed perfect, at least on the surface. But now, cracks were starting to show, and James was beginning to wonder if he had ever really known his wife at all. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "I've got something," he said. "It's about Eleanor." James sat up, his pulse quickening. "Go on." Ethan hesitated, then spoke carefully. "A few months before she died, Eleanor withdrew a large sum of money, cash. No record of where it went. But that's not all. She also had a private email account, one she never used for anything else. I found some old messages she sent, and one of them was to Adam." James felt the air leave his lungs. "What did it say?" It was short. Just one sentence: "You are not safe." James's grip tightened on the phone. Eleanor had known Adam was in danger. She had been trying to protect him. But from what? And why had she never told James? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the full picture remained just out of reach. One thing was clear: whatever had happened to Eleanor wasn't just a tragedy. It was a secret, one that someone had wanted buried. And James was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James barely slept that night. The revelation that Eleanor had not only been in contact with Adam but had also warned him of danger changed everything. His wife hadn't just been doing charity work, she had been involved in something much deeper, something secretive. And now, the only person who could give him answers was a terrified boy who had disappeared into the streets of New York. The next morning, James called Ethan again, his voice tight with urgency. "I need to find Adam. Now." Ethan sighed on the other end of the line. "I figured you'd say that. I've already started asking around, but he's not easy to track. The kid's been living on the streets, moving from place to place. If he doesn't want to be found, it's going to take time." James clenched his jaw. He didn't have time. Every day that passed felt like a missed opportunity, a moment where Adam could slip further away, or worse, into real danger. "Then we need to move faster," he said. "Check every shelter, every food bank, anywhere he might go." Ethan was quiet for a moment before responding. "All right. I'll see what I can do." James hung up and leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had spent his entire career making things happen, bending the world to his will through wealth and power. But now for the first time he felt helpless. Money couldn't buy the answers he needed. As the day passed, he forced himself to go to the office, to sit through meetings and sign papers, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped, hoping for news from Ethan. But the hours dragged on with no update. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James finally gave up pretending to work. He grabbed his coat and headed out, driving aimlessly through the city, his thoughts spinning. He found himself back in Brooklyn near Greenwood Cemetery, the place where everything had started. He didn't know why he had come, but something in his gut told him not to ignore the instinct. He parked and got out, walking through the quiet pathways. The cemetery was empty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. He stood by Eleanor's grave, staring at the headstone, the words carved into the stone feeling like a cruel mockery now. She knew something, didn't she? He muttered under his breath. He had always thought of Eleanor as delicate, someone who needed to be protected. But now he realized she had been stronger than he had ever given her credit for. She had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed. As he turned to leave, movement caught his eye. A small figure, barely visible in the fading light, darted between the gravestones. James's pulse spiked. "Adam," he called out. The figure froze. James took a cautious step forward. "It's me. James Caldwell. I just want to talk." The boy hesitated, then bolted. Without thinking, James took off after him, his expensive shoes slipping on the damp grass. Adam was fast, weaving through the cemetery with the ease of someone used to running. James pushed himself harder, his breath ragged, until Adam made a sharp turn and disappeared behind a mausoleum. When James rounded the corner, the boy was gone. James cursed under his breath, scanning the area. He had been so close. He knew now that Adam was watching him, lingering near Eleanor's grave for a reason. If he was that scared, it meant he had seen something, knew something dangerous. James exhaled, trying to calm his racing heart. He wasn't going to lose him again. He needed a different approach. The next morning he had Ethan reach out to a few contacts who worked in social services, hoping someone might have seen Adam. In the meantime, James did something he hadn't done in years. He went back through Eleanor's old things. He searched through her closet, her desk, even the small safe she had kept in their bedroom. There wasn't much, just old letters, photographs, keepsakes. But then in the back of her desk drawer he found something strange, an old key with no label. He turned it over in his hand, frowning. It wasn't for anything in their house, he was sure of that. His mind raced through possibilities. A storage unit? A safety deposit box? The thought sent a chill down his spine. What had Eleanor locked away that she hadn't told him about? He grabbed his phone and called Ethan. "I need you to check something for me. Find out if Eleanor had a storage unit or a bank box anywhere in the city." Ethan didn't ask questions. "I'll get on it." Hours passed with no word, but just as James was beginning to grow restless, his phone rang. Ethan's voice was tense. "You're not going to believe this. She rented a storage unit in Queens under a different name." James's breath caught. "When?" "Almost a year before she died. And here's the thing, it was paid in cash. No record under her real name." A slow, cold realization settled over James. Eleanor had been hiding something big. And whatever it was, she had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. He grabbed his coat, already moving toward the door. "Send me the address. I'm going there now." Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James drove through the streets of Queens with a growing sense of unease, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he navigated through traffic. The thought that Eleanor had secretly rented a storage unit under a different name haunted him. What had she been hiding? Why hadn't she told him? He had always believed they shared everything, yet this was proof that she had kept something significant from him. As he pulled into the lot of the storage facility, a cold wind swept through the area, making him shiver despite his thick coat. The building was old, the paint on the sign peeling, but it was functional. He stepped out of his car, scanning the area before heading inside. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as James approached. "Can I help you?" James nodded, sliding a fake ID across the counter. One Ethan had arranged for him. "I need access to my unit," he said, keeping his voice steady. The clerk glanced at the ID and nodded, tapping away at the keyboard before grabbing a clipboard. "Unit 47C, he said. "End of the hallway to the right." James took the key Eleanor had hidden and made his way down the dimly lit corridor. His footsteps echoed, the sound bouncing off the metal walls of the storage units. When he reached 47C, he hesitated. A part of him was terrified of what he might find. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key, turned the lock, and pulled the door open. The small, windowless unit was nearly empty except for a single metal filing cabinet and a cardboard box sitting beside it. Dust covered the surfaces, and the air smelled of paper and old wood. James stepped inside, his heart pounding. He crouched by the box first, lifting the lid. Inside he found photographs, dozens of them. Some were of Eleanor, others of people he didn't recognize. But as he flipped through them, one face stood out: Adam. He was younger in these photos, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing beside a woman who looked eerily familiar. James pulled out a picture of the woman and felt his stomach drop. It was the receptionist from the shelter. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Adam wasn't just some random homeless kid Eleanor had helped. There was a connection, one she had deliberately kept from him. Shoving the photos aside, James turned his attention to the filing cabinet. He pulled open the top drawer, rifling through documents, receipts, and letters. Most of it was unremarkable, until he found a thick envelope labeled "Confidential." He tore it open, his hands shaking. Inside were hospital records, court documents, and a birth certificate. He scanned the birth certificate first, his eyes widening as he read the name: Adam Walker Caldwell. His breath caught in his throat. Caldwell. His last name. He flipped through the hospital records, his mind racing. The papers detailed Eleanor's visits to a clinic in Brooklyn, visits he had never known about. The dates matched up to a time when they had been struggling to have children, when she had been devastated by failed attempts to conceive. But this was something else. The court documents were the final piece of the puzzle. They confirmed what James had begun to fear. Adam was Eleanor's biological son. A son she had given up years ago, before she had even met James. A son she had kept secret from him all these years. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. The betrayal cut deep, sharper than anything he had ever felt before. How could she have hidden this from him? Had she ever planned to tell him? And if she had reconnected with Adam, why had she kept it a secret? A fresh wave of questions crashed over him, but before he could think any further, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Ethan's name on the screen. "James," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "You need to get out of there. Now." James's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's been following you. I don't know who, but they're watching you right now. Get out of that storage unit." James's pulse spiked. He turned toward the entrance, his instincts screaming at him to move. Just as he stepped toward the door, he heard the sound of footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. He shoved the papers into his coat, grabbed the photos, and quickly turned off the light. Holding his breath, he pressed himself against the wall, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then, without warning, the doorknob turned. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James barely had time to react before the door creaked open, casting a long shadow across the small storage unit. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure whoever was outside could hear it. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath, gripping the papers he had stuffed into his coat. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. James recognized him immediately. It was the same man he had seen at the shelter the other day, the one who had been watching Adam. The man scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the open filing cabinet and the scattered photographs. His eyes narrowed. James knew he had only seconds before the man noticed him. Thinking fast, he reached for the closest thing he could find, a rusted metal flashlight lying on top of the cabinet. Just as the man took another step inside, James lunged forward, swinging the flashlight with all his strength. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. The man staggered back, cursing under his breath. James didn't wait. He shoved past him, sprinting down the corridor toward the exit. His breath was ragged, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to get somewhere safe. As he burst into the parking lot, he fumbled for his car keys, his hands shaking. He could hear the man behind him, footsteps quickening. James threw open the car door, barely managing to slam it shut before the man reached him. Tires screeched against the pavement as he sped out of the lot, his pulse hammering. He didn't stop driving until he reached the bridge, the lights of Manhattan glowing in the distance. He pulled over, his hands still gripping the wheel tightly. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. His mind replayed everything: the storage unit, the photographs, the name on the birth certificate. Adam was his wife's son. That meant Adam could be his son too. James shut his eyes, trying to process it all. He needed answers. And the only person who could give them to him was Adam. But finding him wouldn't be easy. The boy was on the run, scared, and now James wasn't the only one looking for him. Whoever that man was, he was dangerous. And if he was after Adam, it meant the boy was in more trouble than James had realized. He grabbed his phone and called Ethan. "I found something," he said the moment Ethan answered. "But I think I'm being followed." Ethan swore under his breath. "I told you to get out of there fast." "I did," James snapped. "But now we have a bigger problem. Someone else is after Adam. And I think Eleanor knew about it." There was silence on the other end. Then Ethan sighed. "Meet me at my office. We need to talk." James didn't hesitate. He started the car and drove straight to Ethan's office in Midtown. When he arrived, Ethan was already waiting for him, arms crossed, his expression grim. James wasted no time. He threw the documents onto Ethan's desk. "Adam is Eleanor's son," he said. Ethan's eyes widened as he picked up the birth certificate. "She gave him up for adoption?" James nodded. "Before we met. But she found him again. And she was trying to protect him from something." Ethan scanned the papers, flipping through them quickly. Then he stopped, his expression darkening. "James, this isn't just about adoption." He handed James one of the court documents. James read it quickly, his stomach turning. The adoption had been sealed under unusual circumstances. There had been legal battles, accusations against the adoptive family, and then suddenly, silence. No further records. No information about who had taken Adam in. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the details. "What the hell is this?" James muttered. Ethan rubbed his face. "It means someone powerful was involved in this. Someone who didn't want anyone to find out the truth." James felt a chill run down his spine. "And now that I'm looking for Adam, I've put myself in their sights." Ethan nodded grimly. "And if they're still trying to keep this buried, it means Adam knows something he wasn't supposed to." James clenched his fists. He had started this journey thinking it was about grief, about understanding his wife's past. But now it was about something much bigger. Someone had been trying to keep Adam hidden for years. And Eleanor had tried to protect him. Now it was James's turn. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt that boy. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James sat in Ethan's office, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk as his mind raced through everything he had just learned. Adam wasn't just Eleanor's son. He was the center of a mystery that someone powerful had tried to bury. But why? What had Eleanor discovered that made her hide Adam, and why was someone still looking for him after all these years? He rubbed his temples, exhaustion washing over him, but there was no time to rest. He had to find Adam before whoever was following him did. He looked up at Ethan, who was still flipping through the documents, his brows furrowed in deep thought. "There has to be a way to track him," James said. "If Eleanor found him, she had to have left some kind of trail." Ethan nodded slowly. "She was careful, but no one can disappear completely. We need to think about where she would have told him to go if something went wrong." James exhaled sharply, thinking back to every conversation he had ever had with Eleanor. She had never mentioned Adam, never hinted at anything like this. But she had always believed in having a backup plan. "She loved the Hudson Valley," James said suddenly. "She always talked about how peaceful it was up there." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think she would have sent Adam there?" "I don't know," James admitted. "But I have to start somewhere." Ethan nodded and grabbed his laptop, typing quickly. "There's a small homeless shelter in Poughkeepsie. If Adam was trying to lay low, he might have gone there." James didn't waste another second. He grabbed his coat and keys, ready to leave. The drive upstate felt endless. His thoughts swirled in his head as he tried to piece everything together. The deeper he dug into Eleanor's past, the more secrets he uncovered. How had she kept all of this from him? And more importantly, what exactly had she been protecting Adam from? By the time he reached Poughkeepsie, the sky was dark and the streets were nearly empty. The shelter was a modest brick building, its windows glowing with dim light. James parked and walked inside, his heart pounding. A middle-aged woman at the front desk looked up, offering a tired smile. "Can I help you?" James hesitated, then pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of Adam. "I'm looking for him. Have you seen him?" The woman's smile faded, and she glanced toward the back hallway as if debating whether to answer. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "I just need to talk to him," James said, keeping his voice calm. "It's important." The woman studied him for a long moment before sighing. "He was here," she admitted. "Came in a few days ago, alone and scared. He didn't say much, just that he was looking for someone." James's pulse quickened. "Is he still here?" She shook her head. "Left yesterday." Said he couldn't stay in one place for too long. James clenched his jaw. He had been so close. Do you know where he went? She hesitated again, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He left this behind. It looked important, so I kept it. James took it and unfolded it. It was an old postcard, one he recognized immediately. It was from Eleanor's favorite place in the Catskills, a small lakeside cabin they had once rented years ago. James's chest tightened. If Adam had this, it meant Eleanor had told him about it. Maybe she had even told him to go there. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead he had. He looked back at the woman. Thank you. Without wasting another second, he rushed back to his car and sped toward the Catskills. The winding roads felt familiar yet eerie in the darkness. As he neared the cabin, his headlights caught something on the side of the road, a bicycle half hidden in the bushes. His stomach clenched. He pulled over, heart hammering, and got out. The bike was old and rusted, but it looked recently used. He turned toward the cabin. The windows were dark, but something told him he wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, he approached the front door and knocked. Silence. He knocked again, firmer this time. Adam, he called out. It's me, James. I just want to talk. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open slightly. Adam stood there, his face pale, eyes filled with fear. You shouldn't be here, he whispered. They're looking for me. James's heart twisted. I know. That's why I'm here. We need to talk. Adam hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing James inside. The cabin was cold and sparsely furnished, just as James remembered. Adam sat on the couch, his arms wrapped around himself. Eleanor sent you, didn't she? His voice was barely above a whisper. James swallowed hard. She didn't send me, Adam. She's gone. Adam's face fell, his hands tightening into fists. I know, he said quietly. But she told me if something happened, I should go here. James sat across from him. Who's after you, Adam? Why are you running? The boy hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn-out notebook. He handed it to James. She told me to keep this safe. James opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was filled with notes, dates, and names, records of something big. Something Eleanor had been tracking for years. And at the very bottom of the last page, one name stood out. The same man who had followed James at the storage unit. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James stared at the notebook in his hands, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. The words written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting revealed something far more sinister than he had anticipated. It wasn't just a record of names and dates, it was evidence. Evidence of something she had discovered and tried to expose before her sudden death. His mind raced as he connected the dots. The man who had been following him, the one who had broken into the storage unit, was directly linked to whatever Eleanor had uncovered. But why was Adam in danger? What did a boy like him have that was so important? James looked up at Adam, who sat across from him on the worn-out couch, his arms wrapped around himself as if he was bracing for something terrible. The fear in his eyes wasn't just from being hunted, it was from knowing the truth. Taking a deep breath, James flipped back to the last page of the notebook and pointed to the name at the bottom. This man, do you know who he is? Adam nodded hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor called him, the Fixer. She said he was the one sent to silence people who knew too much. James clenched his jaw, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together in a terrifying way. If Eleanor had been investigating something dangerous, this man had likely been sent to stop her. And now that she was gone, Adam was the only loose end. James closed the notebook and looked at Adam with determination. We can't stay here. It's not safe. Adam's eyes widened. Where will we go? James thought for a moment. They needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere they could lay low while he figured out their next move. Chicago, he said finally. I have an old friend there, someone who can help. Adam hesitated, but he nodded. James grabbed his keys, stuffing the notebook into his coat pocket before leading Adam outside. The night was silent except for the rustling of leaves and the cold wind. As they reached the car, James had a strange feeling, an instinct honed from years of business dealings and knowing when he was being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the dark woods surrounding the cabin. For a moment there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees. His pulse spiked. They had been followed. Without hesitation, James yanked the car door open and shoved Adam inside. Stay down, he ordered before slamming the door shut and running around to the driver's side. Just as he was about to get in, a loud crack split the air, a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past him, hitting the gravel beside the car. Heart pounding, James ducked and yanked the door open, throwing himself into the driver's seat. "Hold on," he shouted as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and he floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as they sped away from the cabin. Adam was curled up in the seat, his hands over his head. James's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he glanced in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared on the winding road behind them. They were being chased. Cursing under his breath, James pushed the car to its limit, speeding down the dark, empty roads of the Catskills. The other vehicle was gaining on them. Whoever was behind the wheel was determined not to let them escape. "Adam," James said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Stay down and keep your head low." The boy nodded, his breath shaky. James needed to think fast. The straight roads ahead would give their pursuer an advantage. He needed to lose them before they reached the highway. Up ahead, the road split. One way led to the main highway, the other toward an old bridge. James made a split-second decision and swerved toward the bridge. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel. The car behind them followed but struggled to keep up. James pushed forward, gripping the wheel tightly as they neared the bridge. It was old and barely maintained, the wooden planks beneath it looking worn and unstable. But James had no choice. He floored the gas and sped across, the tires skidding slightly as they hit the other side. As soon as they were across, James slammed on the brakes and spun the car around to face the bridge. The pursuing car reached the entrance of the bridge, but the driver hesitated. The bridge wasn't built to hold heavy weight. James could see the hesitation in the driver's movements. Then, as if making a final decision, the car started forward. But just as it reached the center, there was a loud, gut-wrenching crack. The wooden beams beneath the car splintered, and before the driver could react, the entire section collapsed, sending the vehicle plunging into the river below. James exhaled, gripping the wheel tightly. He watched for a moment, waiting to see if anyone would emerge. When no one did, he turned to Adam. "Are you okay?" The boy nodded, though his face was pale. James knew they couldn't stay there. Whoever had been in that car wasn't working alone. More would come. He turned the car around and drove off into the night, his mind racing. They needed to get to Chicago as soon as possible. If Eleanor's notebook was right, then the people chasing them weren't just dangerous, they were connected to something much bigger than he had imagined. Something that could get them both killed. As the city lights of Albany appeared in the distance, James glanced at Adam. "We're going to figure this out," he said firmly. "But you have to trust me." Adam met his gaze, and for the first time since they met, the fear in his eyes was mixed with something else, hope. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James drove through the quiet highways of New York, his mind racing as he tried to piece together everything that had happened. Adam sat silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his face pale and tired. The boy had been through more than any child should ever have to endure, and James felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility for keeping him safe. The notebook in his pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of Eleanor's unfinished fight. The bridge collapse had bought them time, but James knew that whoever was after them wouldn't stop. They had made a mistake in underestimating him, but that wouldn't happen again. He had to be smarter. He had to be faster. The neon glow of a gas station sign appeared in the distance, and James slowed the car, pulling into the lot. The station was nearly empty, with only a truck parked near the convenience store. He needed fuel, but more than that, he needed a moment to breathe. As he stepped out of the car, he kept an eye on their surroundings, scanning the darkened highway for any sign of trouble. Adam remained in the car, hunched down in his seat, his small fingers gripping the edges of his jacket. James inserted the nozzle into the tank and let the gas flow, his thoughts racing. Who exactly was the man Eleanor had been investigating? What had she found that had made her a target? He pulled the notebook from his pocket and flipped to the page where Eleanor had written about the fixer. The name was familiar now, not because he had heard it before, but because it had been whispered in business circles for years. A man who cleaned up the messes of the powerful. A man who made people disappear. James clenched his jaw. If that man was involved, then they were in more danger than he had imagined. He replaced the nozzle and walked back toward the car, but as he did, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A dark SUV had pulled into the gas station, its headlights off, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Instinctively, James quickened his pace, yanking open the car door and slipping inside. "Stay down," he whispered to Adam as he turned the key in the ignition. The SUV didn't move, but James could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. He had spent years making deals, reading people, sensing danger before it struck. And right now, every instinct told him they were being watched. He backed out slowly, keeping his movements controlled, his expression neutral. As soon as he pulled onto the highway, the SUV's engine roared to life, its tires screeching against the pavement. James didn't hesitate. He floored the gas pedal, gripping the wheel as the speedometer climbed. "Hold on," he warned Adam, his voice tense. The SUV gained on them quickly, moving with the precision of someone who had done this before. James swerved into the right lane, trying to lose them, but the vehicle matched his every move. The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional streetlight casting eerie shadows on the road. James needed a plan. He couldn't outrun them forever. His eyes flickered to a green exit sign up ahead, Schenectady. He didn't know the city well, but that was an advantage. If he didn't know the streets, neither did the people chasing them. He yanked the wheel and took the exit, tires screeching as he turned onto the winding road. The SUV followed, its headlights illuminating the rearview mirror like two burning eyes. James scanned the area. To his left, a dimly lit industrial zone. To his right, a cluster of abandoned buildings. He made a snap decision and turned sharply, speeding down a narrow alley between two warehouses. The SUV followed but had to slow to make the tight turn. James took the opportunity to put more distance between them, weaving through the maze of old streets. He spotted a loading dock up ahead and slammed the brakes, throwing the car into reverse and backing into the shadows beneath a rusted overhang. He turned off the engine, his heart pounding as he motioned for Adam to stay silent. They waited. The sound of the SUV's engine grew louder as it passed the alley, its headlights sweeping across the buildings. James held his breath. If they stopped, if they turned back, they would be trapped. The seconds stretched into eternity, but then the SUV sped past, its tires screeching as it disappeared around the corner. James exhaled, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. Adam was curled up in the seat, his breathing rapid but quiet. "Are we safe?" he whispered. James nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. For now. He restarted the car and eased out of the alley, keeping his speed low as he navigated through the city. They couldn't stay in Schenectady. They needed to keep moving. Chicago was still the plan, but now he knew they couldn't take any straight routes. The people chasing them were relentless and they had resources. James had been careful his whole life, but he had never dealt with anything like this. This wasn't business, this was survival. As they left the city behind and merged back onto the highway, James glanced at Adam. The boy had been silent for most of the drive, but now his small voice broke the silence. "Why did they kill her?" James tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he would find one. Eleanor had been taken from him and now these people wanted to take Adam too. He wouldn't let that happen. He looked at the road ahead, the dark expanse stretching endlessly before them. This wasn't just about running anymore. This was about fighting back. And James wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. James gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding roads outside Chicago, his mind racing with a mix of adrenaline and fear. Adam sat beside him, his small hands clenched into fists, his face pale and drawn. They had been on the run for days, narrowly escaping the men who were determined to silence them. James had thought he was prepared for this kind of fight, but the deeper they dug into Eleanor's secrets, the more dangerous things became. The notebook she had left behind was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a death warrant for anyone who possessed it. James knew that if they were caught, there would be no negotiations, no second chances. The people hunting them were professionals, and they had already proven they would kill without hesitation. As the city skyline loomed in the distance, James pulled off the highway and into a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't safe to stay in one place for too long, but they needed rest, even if just for a few hours. He parked the car at the far end of the lot, away from the flickering neon sign that cast eerie shadows across the pavement. Adam remained silent as they stepped out of the car and approached the front desk. The clerk barely looked up as James handed over cash for the room, his fingers twitching slightly with paranoia. He took the key and led Adam down the dimly lit hallway, his eyes scanning every corner, every doorway, every shadow that seemed just a little too dark. Inside the room, James locked the door and pulled the curtains shut before collapsing onto the bed. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He pulled out the notebook and flipped through the pages once more, his heart sinking as he read Eleanor's final entries. She had uncovered something massive, something that reached far beyond the corruption they had initially suspected. It wasn't just about money laundering or political bribery, this was about human lives being traded like commodities. The man she had been investigating, the so-called fixer, was more than just a shadowy figure cleaning up the messes of the elite. He was orchestrating something much darker, something that involved disappearances, secret deals, and people who were never seen again. James ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. Eleanor had been so close to exposing the truth, but someone had silenced her before she could. And now they wanted Adam for reasons James still didn't fully understand. He turned to the boy who was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring down at his hands. "Adam," James said gently, "do you remember anything else? Anything about the people your mother was meeting with?" The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She was scared," he whispered. "She said they were more powerful than we could ever imagine. That they could make people disappear without a trace." James exhaled sharply. He had dealt with dangerous people before, but this was on another level entirely. They weren't just running from criminals, they were running from an invisible empire that operated above the law. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to go on the offensive. They needed to find someone who could help. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts, hesitating before dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "James? Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." James clenched his jaw. "I need your help, Michael. And I don't have time to explain." There was a pause, then a deep sigh. "Where are you?" James gave him the name of the motel, knowing it was a risk. He hadn't spoken to Michael in nearly a decade, not since they had worked together on a high-stakes corporate case that had ended in betrayal. But right now, James didn't have many options. Michael had contacts in law enforcement, people who weren't on the payroll of the elites. If anyone could help them, it was him. An hour later, there was a quiet knock at the door. James peered through the peephole before unlocking it, letting Michael inside. The man had aged, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, but his sharp eyes hadn't lost their edge. He took one look at Adam and then at the open notebook on the bed. "You've stepped into something deep, James?" James nodded. "I need to know who this fixer really is. Eleanor found something big before she was killed, and now they're after the boy." Michael sat down, flipping through the notebook, his expression darkening with every page. "I've heard whispers about this guy," he muttered. "No one knows his real name, but he's been cleaning up for the powerful for years. And if he's involved in human trafficking, we're talking about a network that reaches beyond anything the FBI can touch." James felt a cold chill run down his spine. "So what do we do?" Michael looked up, his jaw tightening. "We find him first. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends." James sat in the dimly lit cafe in downtown Chicago, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as he listened to Michael lay out the plan. Across from them, Adam sat quietly, his small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. The weight of the past few weeks hung over them like a storm cloud, each revelation heavier than the last. Michael had spent the past night making calls, digging into every lead James had uncovered in Eleanor's notebook. The name they kept coming back to was a man known only as the Fixer. A ghost in the system, a man who operated in the shadows of power, erasing problems for the elite. James had seen corruption before, but this was different. This was systematic, deliberate, and deeply entrenched. If they were going to take this man down, they needed undeniable proof. Michael had called in a favor from an old FBI contact, someone he believed they could trust. The plan was simple but dangerous. Lure the Fixer into the open by making him believe the evidence Eleanor had collected was about to be exposed. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. If they could record a meeting, catch him in the act, they might have enough to force the authorities to act. James felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes risks, but this time the stakes weren't just his career, they were his life and Adam's future. The boy had already lost too much, and James had sworn to protect him no matter what. That evening they put the plan into motion. James used a secure server to send an encrypted message to an email address he had found in Eleanor's notes, an address linked to one of the Fixer's known associates. The message was short but direct. "I have the files. I know everything. Meet me at the Navy Pier at midnight or they go public." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. They knew this man couldn't afford exposure, and if he believed for even a second that his empire was at risk, he would come. The wait was agonizing. Hours stretched on, the city alive with its usual hum of traffic and distant sirens. Adam stayed close to James, his trust unwavering despite the fear in his eyes. Michael sat by the window of their rented apartment, his gun within reach. At 11:45 James' phone buzzed. A blocked number. He answered, heart pounding. A cold, measured voice spoke on the other end. You're making a mistake. James forced his voice to stay steady. Then meet me and we'll talk. There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. Midnight. Come alone. The line went dead. At the Navy Pier, the wind was sharp against James' face as he stood near the edge, his hands in his pockets, phone recording in his jacket. The pier was nearly deserted at this hour, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. Footsteps echoed behind him and he turned to see a man approaching, tall, impeccably dressed, his presence exuding quiet authority. There was no doubt in James' mind. This was him. The fixer stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. You're either very brave or very stupid, he said calmly. James held his ground. I have everything Eleanor was working on. If anything happens to me, it goes public. The man smirked as if amused. You think you're the first person to try this? You think you can win against people who control everything? His voice was almost pitying. You should take whatever she left you and disappear. The boy too. Walk away while you still can. James clenched his fists. That's not going to happen. A flicker of annoyance crossed the fixer's face. You don't understand what you're dealing with, he said quietly. This doesn't end with one man. If I disappear, another takes my place. The system doesn't break because you want it to. It evolves. And people like you. He tilted his head slightly. People like you vanish. James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Then I guess we'll find out, he said, tapping his pocket. Because I've been recording this entire conversation. And right now, someone else is listening. For the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed the man's face. James had no way of knowing if the bluff worked, but he saw the tension in the fixer's stance, the slight shift in his weight. And then, from the darkness, Michael's voice rang out. FBI. Hands where we can see them. The pier flooded with red and blue lights as agents emerged from the shadows. The fixer didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed as the agents moved in, guns drawn. You think this changes anything? He said quietly to James. The world keeps turning. People like me? We don't fall. We just step aside until it's our time again. James stared at him. Maybe. But at least for now you won't be pulling the strings. As the agents handcuffed the fixer and led him away, James turned to Michael, who gave him a tired nod. It won't stop everything, Michael admitted. But it's a start. James looked at Adam, who stood at a distance, watching silently. The boy had been through hell, but maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at something better now. James put a hand on his shoulder. Let's go home, he said. If you've liked this story, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends.